Hello, my name is Snehal Desai, and I'm going to go over allergic rhinitis in this NAPLEX review course on the respiratory section. And you could see here, these are some of the topics that's generally covered in a NAPLEX exam. Um, so the one we're going to talk about right now is allergic rhinitis. It's a very interesting section. I don't see that there would be so many questions on this or that many questions on it. But at least having understanding is of this section is important. Especially it might be just one or two of the easy questions that at least it would help you answer on the test. And so one of the domains, as I mentioned, is really knowing the mechanism of action of these drugs. So let me talk to you through it so that you can um, use it as a review. So allergic rhinitis essentially a um, is more like allergies. Someone getting exposed to an allergen gets um, detected by the mast cell receptor binds to the allergen and then releases these pro-inflammatory molecules or particles like histamine, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, and cytokines. And you could see here in this diagram that I just went a little bit backwards here, and you could see here the B cell, which is one of the immune cells in our body. It actually produces IgE, immunoglobulins, and those are actually used to bind to the mast cell. Mast cells are essentially those cells that are floating around, usually in like the smooth muscle area of the upper respiratory part, uh, the lungs, the nose, the nasal blood vessels, those areas, and um, then these allergens bind to those receptors and releases these um, inflammatory particles. And what happens is these inflammatory particles then bind to the receptors located in the nasal blood vessels, for example, and causes sneezing or itching, watery eyes, and all of those things. So commonly, you might see a lot of patients taking fluticasone or Flonase to relieve that um, the nasal congestion and all of those um, things that occur nasally. Um, so, what do those kind of steroids do, and how do they work? They're actually going to block or prevent the release of these inflammatory molecules because, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, the steroid, Flonase is a steroid type of medication. So it's going to bind to a glucocorticoid receptor that's located within the mast cell, and then it will program the DNA within the nucleus of that cell so that it can suppress the release of these inflammatory particles like histamines and leukotrienes, and thereby preventing the binding of these inflammatory particles altogether. And so that's essentially how the fluticasone would work, for example, or any kind of inhaled corticosteroid. So you'll see that in this section as well in the next sections of the mechanisms slides. I broke down some of the common medications used as treatments for allergic rhinitis. There isn't a whole lot to explain on this. Some of the mechanisms kind of overlap because they kind of work in the same way. The add-on therapies, you don't really see it a lot. Add-on therapy is like Sudafed, it's mainly used like as a decongestion to prevent that congestion in the like the nasal pathway, for example. So, um, and metazoline, and then uh, Montelukast. If you look at the name Montelukast, it's a leukotriene. So, what it's essentially doing is blocking the um, binding of the leukotriene um, to the leukotriene receptor. So it's going to act as an anti-leukotriene therapy there. And then antihistamines, they're going to essentially do the same thing as like the Montelukast, just going to bind to the H1 receptor that's located in nasal blood vessels. So essentially that's what it is. Now listed second generation antihistamines, and that's mainly because it's less sedation, causes less sedation. Benadryl is actually like a first generation antihistamine, so it's going to cause more of a sedation and make you more tired, drowsy. That doesn't mean that these medications won't cause any drowsiness. There might still be some drowsiness occurring with these medications, but not as much as the first generation. So just also know differences between the two here as well. And then you have the intranasal antihistamines here too, like azolastine. That's another common medication used. I personally have seen in the pharmacies, you would probably see like the 0.1% or the 130, I believe it's 137 microgram strength, but they have those too, and you would typically see those as a prescription, but they would also have it over the counter, but at a different strength. I think the brand name is Asta Pro. So, but if you ever go to a pharmacy, you would probably see the two different strengths of isolastine. So if you're in a pharmacy and you're typing or doing any sort of data entry, or you're just looking up into records, just know there's differences in the strains of those two types of azolastic medications. Uh, and then I'm sure you've seen fluticasone, mometasone, budesonide at some point. Um, Zyrtec, Claritin, Allegra, which are the three second generation antihistamines. There might be others. I just listed a few here just for the purposes of understanding mechanism of the classes of these medications. Um, Also familiarizing with some of the medications that's used within these classes as well. So this is an intranasal corticosteroid. I just wanted to show you a picture of just a general diagram showing how the red circle there is essentially the corticosteroid. You can just say fluticasone, and then it binds to the receptor, which is a glucocorticoid receptor within the mast cell, and then it goes straight to the um, nucleus and binds to um, the DNA, and so alters the gene transcription, downregulates the pro-inflammatory genes, and then upregulates the anti-inflammatory proteins this way. So it prevents like the internal process of that cell from releasing the histamine, leukotrienes, and any of the other inflammatory mediators. And then antihistamines, as I talk to you, it's in the name. They're antihistamines. They're going to block the histamines from binding to the H1 receptor. And that is generally the basis of the mechanism of action of this medication. Um, and then same thing with Montelukast, just going to, you know, stop the binding of leukotriene to the cystinoid leukotriene receptor. So that's going to antagonize it. So it's essentially like the similar type as the histamine, and then antihistamine, and then you got pseudoephedrine, which is going to also bind, but like I mentioned, it's mostly going to decrease congestion. Um, that's because pseudoephedrine is going to bind to alpha 1 receptor. And alpha 1 receptor is essentially going to cause more of the vasoconstriction. It's kind of going to squeeze the prevent more of that blood flow to the nasal part of the pathway. So it's going to decrease congestion this way, um, or cause decongestion. So it's not too much useful, but it is an add-on therapy. It's listed as an add-on therapy for allergic rhinitis overall. Um, and that's pretty much it.